March 21, 1967, War Zone C, Tây Ninh province near the Cambodian border. The jungle does not go silent before a massacre. That's a myth written by people who have never slept on red laterite clay, with sweat in their eyes and insects in their ears. The jungle keeps talking, cicadas grinding like machinery, gibbons shrieking from somewhere high in the canopy, and the constant static hiss of PRC-25 radios trying to push words through humidity so thick it feels alive. At Fire Support Base Gold, the noise is just background. Routine is what matters. Canteen cups balance over small stoves, men rub grit from their eyes, boots that haven't been truly dry in weeks get laced tight anyway. Weapons are checked by touch because muscle memory is the one thing fear can't steal. On the eastern perimeter, a 20-year-old infantryman, call him David, a composite of dozens of accounts, watches the tree line and tells himself that dawn means safety. He has a half-written letter folded in his pocket, the kind of letter that starts with confidence and ends with hesitation. He has an M16 in his hands that feels more familiar than his own fingers. He doesn't feel brave, he feels awake. Before we step into what happened next, take a second. If you want more true stories like this, told with the details that history books usually skip, hit the like button and subscribe. It sounds small, but it matters. It tells the algorithm this is worth showing to more people, and it keeps these stories from disappearing into the noise. Gold is new, too new. 3 days earlier, this place was just a clearing near Suoi Tre, nothing but grass and trees and the kind of ground you'd never notice unless you were trying to die on it. Then the helicopters came and the clearing stopped being jungle and became a target. The insertion on March 19th was ugly. The landing zone was hot. As Hueys flared in, the ground answered with mines and automatic fire. Metal tore, fuel burned, men ran off the birds into elephant grass and smoke. But the airlift didn't stop. It never stops when the plan says it can't. They secured the ground, pushed the perimeter outward, and began turning raw space into a fire base because that's what the larger operation demanded. Zoom out far enough and you can see why Gold exists at all. This is Operation Junction City, the biggest airborne and mobile operation of the war so far. The US command wanted a decisive fight in War Zone C, a dense, unmapped wilderness used as a sanctuary and logistics hub. Intelligence believed the Communist Command Structure, COSVN, the headquarters that haunted briefings and map boards, was hidden somewhere under that canopy. The plan was a hammer and an anvil, blocking forces to cut off escape routes, and a sweeping push meant to drive the enemy into a conventional battle. But War Zone C refuses to behave like a map. It's triple canopy jungle, razor elephant grass, heat that sits in your lungs like wet wool. Americans found stockpiles, bunkers, underground hospitals, propaganda reels, evidence of an enemy presence, but they kept missing the enemy's main force. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese units here didn't stand still. They slipped away, let helicopters land, let patrols pass, and waited, so the commanders changed the bait. If you can't find the tiger, you tether something loud and valuable to a stake and make the tiger come to you. Fire Support Base. Gold was that tether. Now zoom back in. Gold is not a fortress, it's a scar scraped into the jungle. Picture an egg-shaped clearing only a few hundred meters across. Painfully small. Small enough that you could sprint from one side to the other in under a minute if you weren't carrying fear on your back. Around the edge is concertina wire and a patchwork of foxholes and bunkers. Hastily dug, hastily reinforced, never enough. The center holds the prize. The guns of 2nd Battalion, 77th Artillery, 105mm howitzers arranged in firing pits, surrounded by stacks of ammunition, fuel bladders, generators, and vehicles that exist for one purpose: keep the guns firing. The logic is aggressive. From this clearing, the artillery can reach out and shield infantry patrols sweeping the jungle. But aggressive logic has a fatal flaw. To project power, you must sit still. And in War Zone C, anything that sits still becomes a target. The jungle around Gold is not empty, it is teeming. The force watching them is not a handful of local guerrillas with old rifles. It's main force Viet Cong, organized, disciplined, armed with AK-47s, RPGs, heavy mortars, and the patience to move hundreds of men through the jungle without announcing themselves. US accounts identified the attackers as the 272nd Regiment of the Viet Cong 9th Division. Their commander's problem is simple. He cannot win an attrition duel against helicopters, jets, and artillery forever, but he can win a single morning if he picks the right place, the right time, and the right distance. The answer is a doctrine Americans learned to fear: grab them by the belt buckle. Close so tight that US firepower can't be used without killing US troops. Merge the fight into one swirling knot of bodies where technology hesitates and courage is measured in feet, not miles. For 2 nights, the 272nd moved into position. No talking, no smoking, canteens and gear taped down so nothing rattles, mortar base plates drag like anchors, RPG rounds stack like promises. They seeped into the trees around the clearing until they were close enough to smell diesel exhaust and hear transistor radios playing inside the wire, close enough to wait for the signal. Inside Gold, the Americans sensed it. Listening posts reported movement beyond the perimeter. Men checked claymore mines, green plastic boxes filled with C4 and steel balls aimed outward like a shotgun you detonate with a clacker. Trip flares were reset, bunkers were rechecked. For long stretches, there was nothing but the jungle's noise and the imagination filling in the gaps. Then the sky began to lighten. The horizon turned bruised purple, the color of a coming day that doesn't care if you want it. The tension started to leak away in tiny ways. Shoulders relaxing, a man shifting his weight, a voice whispering, maybe it was a wild pig, maybe it was nothing. And then, just after 6:20, a patrol outside the wire fighter on the eastern side walked past a patch of scrub that shouldn't have moved. The brush exploded with muzzle flashes from 10 feet away. Men went down. Radios lit up with sharp, broken calls. Contact east! Contact east! And then deeper in the jungle, the mortars began to cough. Thump, thump, thump. The first law of ambush is sensory overload. Blind the prey, deafen it, paralyze it before it can think. At 6:30 a.m., Gold stopped being routine and became a demolition site. Hundreds of mortar rounds fell in a coordinated pattern, walking inward from the wire toward the center. The impacts came so fast that the ground didn't just shake, it liquefied. Red soil churned into a mist that hung in the air, mixing with black smoke from burning fuel. Shrapnel chewed antenna masts. Radios died. The Tactical Operations Center took hits that turned it into a broken nerve center screaming into deadlines. Units stopped being a battalion and became islands. Small groups of men defending 3 feet of dirt because that was the only piece of earth that still felt like theirs. Secondary explosions made it worse. A vehicle or ammunition pile caught a direct hit and blew apart, detonating additional rounds in a chain reaction that felt like the base was being attacked from inside itself. Smoke thickened until visibility collapsed. Men fired at movement, at sound, at instinct. Then the barrage lifted just enough, and the jungle stood up. From the eastern tree line, figures rose out of the grass and sprinted toward the wire. Not one or two, dozens, then hundreds. The human wave is often dismissed as a mindless charge. That's not what it is. It's mass applied like a tool against a weak point. The first wave carries breaching gear, bangalores, wire cutters, satchel charges, men whose job is to create openings even if they die on the wire doing it. Behind them come suppressors, RPG teams, and machine gunners, pouring fire into bunkers to force defenders to duck. Then the assault groups, AK-47s, grenades, momentum, speed. Claymores detonated, a click and then a flat, brutal blast that shredded the first ranks. Bodies fell into the wire. For a heartbeat, it looked like it worked. Then the next rank stepped over them. M60 machine guns opened up, cutting lanes into the grass. Barrels heated until they glowed dull red. Rifles cracked in frantic rhythm. Men screamed for ammunition. A defender in a bunker tried to reload with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. The math took over. A US platoon might have 30 men holding a sector. Against them came several hundred attackers pressing one breach point. They weren't overrun because they lacked courage. They were overrun because they began to run out of bullets before the enemy began to run out of bodies. An RPG streaked out of the smoke and hit a key bunker. Sandbags erupted like a wave. The gun in that position went silent. The wire was breached. Viet Cong troops poured through like water through a broken dam, fanning out behind American fighting holes, turning a perimeter defense into a close-range nightmare. The battle transformed instantly from a firefight into a knife fight in a closet. In the center, artillerymen watched the line crumble. They weren't supposed to see the enemy. They were supposed to fight by coordinates, by distance, by numbers on a map. Now they could see silhouettes sprinting through smoke straight toward the guns. This is the moment that decides whether Gold becomes a propaganda trophy or a slaughter pit. The artillery commander made the only decision he could. Drop the tubes, zero elevation, Beehive. Beehive rounds, 105mm anti-personnel canister shells packed with thousands of steel flechettes, were designed for exactly this, close assault. The gun barrels depressed until they were nearly level with the ground. Crews rammed the round into the breach. A lanyard was pulled. The sound was not a normal artillery boom. It was a tearing, ripping noise, like canvas being shredded by something immense. The shell burst, and a cone of tiny darts screamed outward. Men in the open didn't just fall. They disappeared into the grass in a way that made even hardened fighters hesitate. Leaves stripped off branches. Wooden crates turned to splinters. The air in front of the gun became a solid block of cutting steel. For a moment, the eastern approach stalled. Then the Viet Cong adapted again. They stopped charging in dense groups and started crawling. They used shell craters as cover. They pushed RPG teams forward to silence the guns because they understood the truth immediately. If the howitzers keep firing direct, the assault dies here. On the northern side, a quad .50 caliber mount hammered the tree line. 4 heavy machine guns on a turret, officially meant for anti-aircraft work, but in Vietnam used as a meat grinder. The attackers focused RPG fire on it. The mount was hit, overrun, and threatened to be turned back on the defenders. In a decision that shows you how desperate this fight became, a howitzer crew fired direct high explosive and destroyed the quad rather than allow it to be used against them. Lines blurred. The Viet Cong achieved their hug. Americans and attackers mixed in pockets, sharing the same shell holes, firing at each other from distances where you can smell breath and powder. That intermingling paralyzed outside support. Jets circled, but pilots couldn't always see who was who through smoke. Artillery from other positions hesitated because shells don't care about uniforms. A forward air controller arrived overhead in a small spotter aircraft and began directing strikes along the tree line, bringing in fighters low and fast. For a short time, napalm and bombs carved space, burning foliage where attackers used cover, buying the defenders seconds and minutes they didn't otherwise have. Then the spotter plane was hit by heavy automatic fire and went down beyond the trees, killing its crew and choking off the air coordination action when it was needed most. Inside the base, the battle compressed into pure survival. Ammunition became a currency that vanished too fast. Beehive rounds were used up. Crews switched to high explosive at point-blank range, firing into the ground in front of the guns with fuses set to explode immediately or after a short delay, using the earth itself as a weapon. Infantrymen who had fallen back to secondary positions formed a tight ring around the remaining guns. Clerks, cooks, radio operators, anyone who could hold a rifle, joined the line because the line no longer belonged to infantry alone. The perimeter became sandbags and gun wheels and whatever wreckage could stop a man from stepping through. Somewhere in that shrinking circle, David kept firing. He no longer knew the time. He no longer knew where east was. He only knew that if the enemy reached the guns, the base was finished, and if the base was finished, everyone inside it would be finished too. And then, deep under the gunfire and explosions, another sound began to creep into the ground, a low vibration, mechanical, steady, heavy. Not mortars, not artillery, tracks. Outside Gold, the relief force had finally forced the jungle to give way. Elements of infantry were moving toward the Firebase, but the critical punch came from armor and mechanized infantry pushing hard through War Zone C. The relief column hit a major obstacle at the Suoi River, a muddy barrier with steep banks that threatened to turn tanks into stuck steel coffins. Scouts searched frantically for a crossing. Vehicles churned mud. Engines ran hot. The radio traffic from Gold turned more desperate by the minute. Eventually a crossing point was found. M113 armored personnel carriers, amphibious but still clumsy in mud, fought for traction on the far bank. Tanks followed, heavier and less forgiving, driving on the bottom and clawing their way out, water streaming off turrets like surfacing beasts. The column reorganized and aimed itself straight at the sound of the battle. At roughly 9 a.m., the jungle on Gold's southwest edge exploded outward, not with an enemy wave, but with 50 tons of American steel. The first tank burst through the tree line with its turret already traversing. Behind it came more armor and carriers, then mechanized infantry jumping off and fanning into the clearing. To the defenders, it felt like the world's axis shifted. They had been fighting a collapsing circle for hours, and suddenly there was momentum pushing outward. To the Viet Cong, it was catastrophe. Their plan accounted for infantry, mortars, close-range chaos, even airstrikes constrained by intermingled troops. It did not account for armored vehicles driving directly into their assault formations and ripping them apart with canister and heavy machine gun fire. The tanks fired anti-personnel rounds that turned the main gun into a giant shotgun. 50 caliber fire hammered the tree line in slow, heavy rhythm. The disciplined structure of the assault began to fracture, but it didn't end instantly. It intensified. Now the attackers were trapped between the base they hadn't finished and the armor that had arrived at their flank and rear. They tried to fight the tanks with RPGs. Some rockets found their mark, damaging carriers and forcing infantry to bail out coughing, weapons up. But the momentum had shifted, and momentum in battle is a kind of gravity. Once it turns against you, every decision becomes harder. The defenders inside Gold surged outward behind the armor, not because they suddenly became fearless, but because they were angry and because the battle had moved from hold to recover. Infantry walked beside tanks, clearing craters and foxholes, hunting RPG teams before another rocket could bite. The noise of the fight changed pitch, from continuous storm to sporadic sharp pops as pockets of resistance were smashed and then hunted down. By mid-morning, the heaviest firing began to fall away. Smoke lifted in slow columns through holes in the canopy. The sun finally showed itself, harsh and uncaring, turning the clearing's red earth into a heat mirror. When the shooting slowed enough to hear the jungle again, it didn't feel like peace. It felt like exhaustion. And then came the accounting. Numbers in Vietnam were never just numbers. They were metrics, arguments, proof, propaganda, and grief, depending on who spoke them. US reports would claim roughly 30 Americans killed and over 100 wounded. Enemy dead were counted in the hundreds, with US claims around 600 plus Viet Cong killed and many weapons recovered. AK-47s, mortars, RPG launchers stacked like firewood. The ratio looked lopsided on paper, a textbook example of firepower crushing mass. Commanders could look at that and call it validation. Men who had been inside the wire did not use that word. For David, the afternoon didn't feel like victory. It felt like his body realizing it was still alive. He tasted smoke and dust. His ears rang so loudly the world sounded distant. He saw artillerymen, the ones who had fired Beehive at nearly zero elevation, sitting with their backs against sandbags, staring at the ground, faces blank. Artillerymen are supposed to fight a war of coordinates, firing at unseen points miles away. At Gold, they fought face to face with a cannon. The intimacy of that violence does something to a person. It doesn't leave when you leave. The cleanup was the part nobody put in speeches. Bodies could not stay where they lay. The base had to function again because fire support bases don't get to retire. Bulldozers arrived, men dragged wreckage, weapons were gathered and tagged. The jungle began reclaiming the edges almost immediately, as if it were embarrassed by what had happened in its clearing. On the strategic level, Suối Tre became an argument. To some, it proved that if you could force the Viet Cong into a stand-up fight, American American firepower would bleed them dry. But the enemy drew lessons too. Main force units didn't vanish forever because they took heavy losses. They adapted. They shifted tactics towards sapper attacks, ambushes, and fighting on terrain, and terms that reduced the advantage of armor and artillery. The war did not end because one regiment was mauled on one morning. The war changed shape and moved its weight elsewhere. Years later, the clearing near Suối Tre would not be marked with monuments. The land would become plantations and fields, and most people passing through would have no reason to think the soil once shook with mortars and tank tracks. But those who survived carried the coordinate inside them. They remembered the purple dawn, the smell of diesel, the moment the perimeter became an idea instead of a wire, the sound of Beehive rounds ripping the air, the low vibration of tanks arriving like thunder you could feel in your teeth. David eventually finished his letter. Not that day, not that week, maybe not for months. And when he finally wrote, he didn't have the language for the full truth. He wrote the simplest things because simple things were all he could trust. I'm alive, I'm tired, the jungle is loud, I miss home, and the last truth of Fire Support Base Gold was always the same. They proved they could win the day, but in Vietnam, the night always waited for its turn.